Hi, I'm Dr. Charles Harry, and this is Cybersecurity for Everyone. In this video, I want to talk about how we move away from a small government-sponsored program into something that's more widely accepted. By the late 1960s, ARPANET demonstrated that a distributed and digitized network was feasible. And remember, ARPANET was this ability to move packetized data from one part of the earth to the next. And that had been developed as a general idea in the early part of the 1960s and late 1950s. This academic vision had been supported by government sponsorship, by DARPA, to prove out that there was in fact a way to enable this radical new way of communicating. And the original vision by the late 1960s was that only 256 addresses would be needed on this internetwork. Because remember, at this time, computers were the size of an entire room. So people had a really hard time envisioning that all of us one day would have access to computing power that could fit in the palm of our hand. So how did that change? Well, how did this concept of internetworking become more popular? And that's the story that I want to explore today. So the story of the late 1960s through the 1970s is about the expanding popularity of networks and new developments in computing technology. With the success of ARPANET and the progression of all these new protocols and instructions and applications, there are new networks that are being developed, but they tend to be ad hoc, meaning that they're built with their own set of instructions and their own set of technologies in some cases. By the early 1970s, though, a new standardized method for networking has been invented. This approach, called Ethernet, had been developed at the Xerox Corporation. Ethernet is one of these foundational technologies that we still use today. But a standardized way of networking allows a whole range of incentives by private sector corporations to develop new technologies and to adopt those technologies as they become cheaper to implement. So by the 1970s, the story becomes one where we're combining new technologies. We have a new standardized way of networking. We have the ability to move more computer terminals to be used by private corporations. More companies in the Fortune 500 are using computer terminals to do their business. They're moving away purely from pen and paper. And by the latter part of the 1970s into the early 1980s, the development of new standard personal computers, things like the Apple I and the Apple II, are developed. And new corporations like Apple Computing and Microsoft are built on this idea, this new vision, that computing technology will actually come to the masses. So the explosion of networks and computers create the need for new technologies and new instructions to be conceived and developed. One good example, because there are hundreds that I could cite, but I just want to talk about a few. One good example is the ability to have these addresses, these computer addresses. We talked about Internet Protocol before, and we'll talk about it in more depth in another video. But the idea that we have these very arcane addresses, things like 8.8.8.8, and being able to convert that into something that's more human-friendly, like Google. So we need a set of instructions that allow us to do this translation. And so we developed something called the Domain Name System, or DNS, which is just simply a set of instructions that say, hey, this computer-friendly term, 8.8.8.8, is really just Google, which is a human-friendly term, this ability to translate. We also needed to invent ways to route all this packetized data between networks, because as we increase the number of nodes in ARPANET, the different organizations that are connected to one another, we need to have more efficient ways in which we route that data. So we come up with the term routers. And you remember in an early video, we talked about this need for a black box. Well, that's what the routers end up being created for, to serve as this black box to route information. So in the 1970s, up and through the early 1980s, key technologies and instructions are written. Scaling the technology enables communities of interest to develop. As more and more people find the beneficial uses of this internetworking technology and computer technology, new communities of interest form. But they are built around very specific purposes. For example, at the Department of Energy and at NASA, they created their own networks to facilitate research and collaboration around very, very specific topics, whether it was space exploration or the use of nuclear technology. And by the early 1980s, even the military is utilizing this technology more widely. As these new communities of interest develop, ownership of this internetworking technology begins to emerge. One of the key decisions made early on was that there needed to be public availability of all the documents specifying these instructions. Because if this is to grow organically, if we are to see this technology more widely accepted, then people need to understand what the instructions are so they can build their applications and their tools to conform with those standard instructions. This leads to an acceleration of growth in the adoption of new technologies. New companies are formed built around developing technology that implement those common instructions. But those instructions are developed within a public community. Remember, the internet or internetworking is not owned by a single organization or government. It is owned by all of us, the entire planet. So it creates this feedback loop of leading to additional growth and adoption. And because it's open source, it allows people to, in a very public way, to create the best possible instructions in a way that's very open and collaborative. And today, there are dozens, well over 75 working groups that are working on instructions for the next generation of technology. Things like autonomous cars, things like smart devices. Those instructions about how those technologies are developed are being actively debated in these global communities. So, in the 1970s through the 1980s, we moved from an ARPANET that consists of just a handful of nodes in the west coast of the United States to, by 1981 in this graphic, you can see that it now spans, or we have nodes that span across the entire United States. So, what did we take away from today? The private sector helped drive the growth of the internet through the development of scaling technologies, things like Ethernet at the Xerox Corporation. But we also see during this time community development that allows us to accelerate standard adoption. And so by the early 1980s, multiple purpose-driven networks are now connected together. This is really the foundation of what we know now as the internet. In our next video, we're going to talk about how this foundation of the internet goes from being something that's sponsored by DARPA into something that is privatized, that is transitioned to be wholly owned by the private sector. I hope to see you next time.